Vasili Blin. Vasili was born in 1895 in what is now Russia, and grew up to become Stalin's go-to guy for, well, murdering people en masse. Blin worked for the Soviet NKVD, Stalin's secret police, where his job description was to essentially shoot people in the head and don't complain about it. And oh boy, did he deliver. He got his big break during Stalin's purges in the 1930s, when the dictator decided that pretty much anyone who breathed wrong was a threat to the Soviet Union. Blin's preferred execution method was a pistol shot to the back of the head, chosen for its efficiency and because it saved on cleanup. He liked German Walter pistols for their reliability, even importing them to make his work smoother. Over his career, Blin reportedly killed tens of thousands, though he's most famous for the Katyn massacre in 1940. This delightful little episode saw him personally executing around 7,000 Polish prisoners over 28 nights. That's roughly 250 people a night, a rate so high you'd think he was running a macabre assembly line. He wore a leather apron, gloves, and cap to avoid getting blood all over himself. Treating his nightly slaughter like a butcher might prepare for cutting meat. Blin's victims were mostly Polish officers, intellectuals, and other enemies of the state hauled in for mass executions during World War II. He didn't show much emotion about it, which you'd think might be standard for an executioner. But even among this profession, his total lack of humanity was something else. Stalin trusted him completely, because why wouldn't you trust the guy who'll execute anyone you point at without a second thought? Blin retired in 1953 after Stalin's death, probably because the new Soviet leadership wasn't sure if they needed someone that good at mass murder hanging around. He was quietly pensioned off, but by then, his mental health had reportedly started to collapse, which seems inevitable after spending decades as a one-man slaughterhouse. He died in 1955, officially from taking his own life, though there's some debate over what actually happened. Either way, he went out as unceremoniously as he lived. Albert Pierrepoint. This man, Albert, didn't grow up dreaming of being one of history's most prolific executioners, but family business called, and what a family business it was. Born in 1905 in Yorkshire, England, Albert came into a world where his father and uncle were already knee-deep in ropes and gallows. His dad, Henry, had been a hangman before losing the gig over too much drinking. Uncle Thomas Pierrepoint, meanwhile, was still swinging necks for the crown. So yeah, you could say Albert's career path came with no bits of surprise. Albert started in 1932, a 27-year-old ready to carry on the legacy of legally sanctioned murder. First order of business is to learn the trade. Execution for them was a craft, not some gig where you just tie a knot and then let the bodies hit the floor. The British government had rules, regulations, and an entire manual detailing the proper way to kill people. Albert studied the mechanics like he was cramming for finals. Rope length, neck size, body weight. It was a math problem where the wrong answer meant a messy job. And Pierrepoint wasn't about messes. He had a reputation for being quick, clean, and utterly devoid of emotion. The guy could snap a neck in under 10 seconds. A model of efficiency if you're into that kind of thing. Ever heard of Mike Ehrmantraut? Yeah, this guy. Kind of like him. World War II came along, and Pierrepoint's career skyrocketed, which is saying something for a guy whose job was already state-sponsored killing. After the war ended, Britain decided it was time to make an example out of captured Nazi war criminals. Guess who got the call? Albert was flown out to Germany in 1945 to execute over 200 of them. Think concentration camp guards, Nazi officials, and others responsible for unimaginable atrocities. His most famous client during this stint was Joseph Kramer, nicknamed the Beast of Belsen, who oversaw the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Kramer got the noose like the rest, and Albert didn't bat an eye. Not that he ever did, but let's not pretend Albert's work was confined to Nazi war criminals. Back in the UK, he hanged regular murderers like it was a 9 to 5. One of the most controversial cases under his belt was Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be executed in the UK. She shot her abusive boyfriend, and public opinion was split on whether she deserved the noose or a bit of mercy. Did Albert care? Doubt it. His job was to pull the lever, not get into the moral weeds. What made Pierrepoint stand out was how he treated the condemned. He wasn't a sadist or a showman. If anything, he was disturbingly professional. He'd walk into the cell, introduce himself, and make small talk like he was meeting them for tea instead of their last moments on Earth. Some called it compassion, others probably thought it was creepy as heck. Either way, Albert believed in keeping things as calm and quick as possible. He wasn't there to make them suffer, just to get the job done. By the 1950s, Pierrepoint was a household name, which is wild when you think about it. How many executioners get that kind of fame? But the job started weighing on him. Or maybe it was the growing controversy around capital punishment in the UK. In 1956, he walked away from the profession, not with a bang, but with a simple resignation. He spent the rest of his life running a pub, a far cry from the gallows. Customers probably bought him drinks just to hear stories about his days tying ropes and breaking necks. Albert died in 1992. Charles-Henri Sanson. Charles-Henri was born in 1739, inherited the family business of chopping heads because being a butcher for the state runs in the blood. His dad, Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson, was the executioner before him, so little Charles grew up in a household where the family trade involved axes, ropes, and buckets. At 15, he was already getting groomed for the job. His father gave him the keys to the executioner's toolbox, probably like someone else might hand over a family recipe book. Congrats, kid! Your life is officially dedicated to legally sanctioned murder. In 1754, Charles Jean-Baptiste passed away. That left Charles-Henri to become the executioner of Paris at a very old age of 15. He wasn't thrilled, but he didn't have much of a choice. The family business wasn't something you could say no to. And what a career he had. Over the next 4 decades, this guy got up close and personal with the business end of human necks. He executed people for everything from theft to treason. He used various tools like ropes for hanging and wheels for that medieval torture flare. The guy had a solid repertoire. By the time the French Revolution rolled around in the late 1780s, Sanson's resume was already pretty stacked. But then came the big leagues. The revolution turned Paris into a public execution theme park, and Sanson was the main attraction. The guillotine, or as they called it, the national razor, became the star of the show. Sanson made it famous. He was the guy who gave it a workout, turning it into the go-to method for lopping off heads. In 1793, Charles-Henri landed his most high-profile gig, executing King Louis XVI. The former king, now citizen Louis Capet, took his final stroll to the guillotine in January of that year. Sanson, the professional that he was, handled it with the kind of calm efficiency you'd expect from someone who had literally killed thousands of people by then. It wasn't his first royal execution, but it was the most significant. The king's head ended up in a basket, and the revolution kicked into high gear. Sanson later executed Queen Marie Antoinette, along with a parade of other nobles, clergy, and anyone else the revolutionaries decided was better off dead. During the Reign of Terror, Sanson's workload exploded. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dishing out death sentences left and right. It's estimated he executed over 3,000 people, making him one of the busiest executioners in history. And while most people would probably burn out after a couple of hundred heads, Sanson kept showing up for work. Again, he didn't like it. There are records of him writing about the toll it took on him, which, yeah, no way, buddy. Didn't expect that. Jack Ketch. See, Jack was England's most infamous executioner in the late 17th century. But unlike the other two, he was sloppy. Born sometime before the 1660s, Ketch found himself in a job nobody really wanted. Back then, execution was entertainment more than a scare. Hence, you needed to make it quick and clean. Ketch? Not so much. His incompetence turned a gruesome job into an even bloodier mess, making his name a byword for botched brutality. He became the official executioner of London around the 1670s. Ketch didn't exactly roll out of bed one day and think, I want to be the guy who chops off heads for a living. No, executioners were usually people who didn't have many other options. And judging by his track record, it's clear Ketch wasn't in this line of work for passion or talent. He just had an axe, and apparently not much else going on. His most infamous screw-up came in 1683 during the execution of Lord William Russell, a prominent Whig politician convicted of treason. Russell was a big deal, so naturally, a clean, dignified execution was expected. Ketch completely botched it. He swung the axe multiple times, missing the mark repeatedly, and turned what should have been a swift death into a horrifying spectacle. Went as well as you'd expect it to be. Horrified crowds were there. Lord Russell was getting beat up rather than killed. Let's ask Jack just what the heck happened. Yo, what happened? I kinda botched it, but it was my tool's fault, believe me. Yeah, I'll get back to you eventually. I'm not really sure the tools would sharpen themselves anyway, so that's kinda on you. Oh, come on, you got to at least give me some credit. The job was finished. I would have let it slide if that was the only time you went full-on dum-dum. 2 years later, in 1685, Ketch executed James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, another high-profile victim. Monmouth's execution was a disaster. After several failed swings, Ketch had to use a knife to finish the job. He downgraded from axe to knife mid-execution. Even in the 1600s, that kind of amateur hour would get you fired. People were so disgusted that they started calling any bad execution a Ketch job. His name literally became slang for incompetence. And I won't be using ketchup for the next 4 weeks. Homophones scare me. Executioners weren't loved, but Ketch was actively hated. People mocked him, hated him, and probably avoided him in the street. He made enemies in high and low places alike. Even the condemned preferred someone else to swing the axe. If that's not a professional low, I don't know what is. By the time he was replaced, it was fully deserved. His successors inherited a reputation that was already in the gutter thanks to his bungling. Executioners after him could have been flawless, but the damage to the job's reputation was already there. Frantz Schmidt. Dude was released by his mommy into an executioner family. No one in his family wanted to be one, but they didn't have any choice. He started his training as a kid. That's right, while most kids were learning to farm or maybe swing a hammer, young Frantz was learning to swing an axe. By 1573, at just 18, Frantz got his first official gig as an executioner in the Bavarian town of Bamberg. His job involved floggings, amputations, and whatever other punishment the law cooked up for criminals. Public executions were considered a form of justice and entertainment, so there goes your cinematic director's cut. In 1578, he moved to Nuremberg, where he spent most of his career. Over 45 years, he executed 361 people and tortured or punished nearly as many. Think of it as a full-time job with overtime. He meticulously recorded every execution in his journal, like a medieval accountant of death. His records tell us a lot about the justice system back then. Crimes ranged from theft to murder to witchcraft, and the punishments were as imaginative as they were horrifying. You steal something, you might lose a hand. Accused of witchcraft, enjoy being burned alive. For an executioner, following a code of conduct is wild, and wild is he who followed one. Like Frantz, he believed his work was a necessary part of maintaining order. I am become axe, destroyer of criminals, under the law, Oppenheimer style. In his journal, he often wrote about the crimes his victims committed and the method of their punishment. For him, it was about justice, not vengeance. He didn't take pleasure in the act, but he also didn't flinch. It's hard to say if that made him noble or just terrifying. Probably both. One of his most infamous cases involved a man convicted of murdering his own family. The punishment was to be broken on the wheel. If you're not familiar, this delightful method involved tying the person to a wheel and smashing their limbs with a heavy iron bar. It was slow, excruciating, and a crowd favorite. Franz's notes on the case were clinical, as if he were logging inventory. Despite his gruesome profession, Frantz managed to retire in 1617 and even gained some respectability. The City Council of Nuremberg granted him the status of a regular citizen. That's like getting a gold watch for retiring from decades of state-sanctioned murder. He spent his remaining years reflecting on his career, writing down more details about his work, and probably scaring the hell out of anyone who dared ask him about it. Robert G. Elliot. Robert G. Elliot started his life in 1874 in Hamlin, New York, probably never dreaming that he'd end up being one of the most prolific executioners in American history. By the 1920s, he'd built a career as an electrician, but apparently that wasn't enough to keep him busy. So, he started working part-time as an executioner. You know, because that's a normal career pivot. His first execution was in 1926, and over the next 13 years, he sent 387 people to the electric chair. If you've ever wondered who makes death look like a day job, here's your guy. Elliot didn't limit his services to one place. He worked for New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Kind of like a traveling salesman, but instead of selling vacuum cleaners, he turns on two. That was a Green Mile reference. He called the electric chair Old Sparky, which is just charming. He approached the whole thing like a technician fine-tuning a machine. He'd inspect the equipment, check the wiring, and make sure everything was working properly. Because, you know, the last thing you want during an execution is a technical hiccup. Let's not gloss over the fact that some of his clients were infamous criminals, Sacco and Vanzetti. Those two anarchists were convicted of robbery and murder, though plenty of people questioned if they were guilty. Didn't matter. Elliot was there to do the job, no questions asked. He also handled the executions of Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray, who were convicted of murdering Snyder's husband. That one even made headlines because someone snuck a camera into the execution chamber and snapped a photo of Snyder in the chair. Elliot's work ended up being front-page news. Now you've seen those people from earlier be uncomfortable with it or salivate at the sight of people dying. Elliot wasn't even a fan of capital punishment. He once said it didn't do much to stop crime and called it a relic of barbarism. But the checks cleared, and he kept showing up. He justified it by saying he was just a cog in the machine. A very well-paid cog, mind you. He had this weird code of professionalism about the whole thing. He refused to drink alcohol before executions, which feels like the absolute bare minimum for a guy with his job. He also didn't allow photographers in the execution chamber. Too bad about that Snyder photo, huh? He tried to keep the whole process as dignified as you can when you're electrocuting someone to death. Elliot eventually retired in 1939 after he'd clocked in enough executions to fill a small stadium. He died the same year. Thomas Derrick. Thomas was a guy who landed the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, but it came with a catch that most people would rather avoid. In the late 16th century in England, Derrick was arrested and charged with, grape. a crime that typically ended with the accused swinging from the gallows. Instead of getting what he probably deserved, Derrick managed to wrangle a pardon from the authorities, but only if he agreed to become an executioner. Because, letting a criminal chop off heads and string people up sounds like a genius move. Anyway, Derrick accepted, probably because the alternative wasn't great, and he went on to execute over 3,000 people during his illustrious career. Among his many victims was his former master, the Earl of Essex, who had the bad luck of plotting a rebellion against Queen Elizabeth I in 1601. That must have been an awkward moment. Derrick standing there with the gallows he invented, getting ready to hang the guy who used to boss him around. Speaking of that gallows, Derrick also got a little inventive. He created a new type of gallows, cleverly named the Derrick. This contraption made the job of hanging people faster and more efficient, hence, his body count reaching 4 digits. It's not like he had a second or third or 18th job to go to. Whether Derrick enjoyed his work or just went through the motions isn't really clear. But executing thousands of people in a time before antiseptic or therapy probably wasn't great for his mental health. But he kept at it. Derrick's career eventually ended, though no one seems to have bothered writing down when or how he retired. So I'm gonna go on a limb here and just assume he either died on the job or found something less depressing to do, like literally anything. But that is, if that was even possible after a resume like his. No one really talks about what happened to him after his executioner days. Sounds about right for a guy who's known for his killing machine. William Calcraft. The man started his career in 1829, earning a living as a cobbler before stepping into the cheery world of executions. Hired as the official hangman for London and later the entire United Kingdom, Calcraft was famous for taking his time. His preferred method, the short drop, was pretty much a public torture session. Instead of breaking the neck instantly, it relied on strangulation. People would hang there, writhing and kicking, for minutes or even longer. And oh, the Victorian English people loved a good public hanging, treating them like a messed up version of Sunday brunch. Calcraft wasn't shy about playing to the audience either, sometimes yanking on the condemned's legs to speed things up or, just make it look more dramatic. Over his 45-year career, he executed around 450 people, ranging from murderers to petty thieves who probably just stole a loaf of bread. Life was cheap, and Calcraft was on the payroll to prove it. Despite being terrible at his job by today's standards, Calcraft stuck around until 1874, when he finally called it quits. It was almost the right time. He realized people started thinking hangmen should aim for faster sessions, because as Jacksepticeye said, speed is key. By that time, he'd been involved in more executions than most people attend birthday parties. But retirement was a bummer. He died in 1879, mostly forgotten except for being that guy who made executions his personal sandbox. John C. Woods. Before an executioner, the dude was a U.S. Army Master Sergeant. So surprise, surprise, but he's got an experience with hurting people in general. Not. Born in 1911, this Kansas native had no formal training in the field, but claimed he'd handled over 300 hangings by the time he arrived at Nuremberg in 1945. That number was as high as something a high school try-hard cool kid would say if asked how many girls they've dated on the first day of class. His actual experience was questionable at best. With prior botched executions and a reputation for shady methods, Woods managed to land the gig anyway. When the Nuremberg trials handed down death sentences for 10 high-ranking Nazis, Woods stepped in, rope in hand, ready to turn justice into a live-action circus. And here we go with executioners having fun with their prey once more. His unorthodox approach meant several prisoners suffered prolonged deaths. Whether through incompetence or sheer indifference, his work came with a side of horror. The executions took place on October 16, 1946, with Woods and his assistant handling the hangings of war criminals like Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, and Alfred Jodl. Woods insisted on using a short drop hanging method. For context, a proper long drop hanging is supposed to snap the neck, leading to instant death. I feel like I should have mentioned this information with the William Calcraft bit earlier. Woods apparently didn't feel like following those guidelines, or maybe he just didn't care enough to learn them. Instead, his approach caused some prisoners to strangle for minutes. If that wasn't enough, the scaffold itself was poorly constructed. There were even stories of injuries to the condemned as they were forced to climb to their deaths. Woods was later asked about the criticism of his methods. Why exactly are we seeing injuries to the criminals that's totally unrelated to hanging? I wasn't being paid to be a perfectionist. After the Nuremberg executions, Woods returned to his regular military duties, though it's hard to imagine anyone throwing him a welcome-back party. His career didn't last much longer. In 1950, during a routine electrical repair job on a base in Guam, Woods met his own end in what can only be described as a deeply ironic accident. He was electrocuted while handling equipment. Ezzelino Romano. Ezzelino was born in 1194 in northern Italy, where he grew up in a family that already had a reputation for power-hungry scheming. He must have taken that legacy to heart, because by the time he rose to power, the guy made every medieval tyrant look like a softie. Ezzelino's big break came when he aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who handed him control over Verona and Padua. Naturally, Ezzelino wasted no time turning these places into his personal slaughterhouses. His favorite hobby was executing anyone who crossed him, sometimes for reasons as trivial as being in the wrong political faction. One of his greatest hits involved tying victims to wild horses and letting them get dragged to death. He reportedly executed more than 10,000 people during his reign. With Ezzelino having this power, he upgraded from ruler to psychotic tyrant, and even his allies started thinking, maybe this guy's a bit much. Frederick II eventually got sick of him, and his enemies grew bolder. Of course, Ezzelino wasn't about to go quietly. In 1259, he was finally captured after a failed attempt to defend his turf, but even in defeat, he refused to play nice. Instead of surrendering, he ripped off his bandages and let himself bleed to death. When Ezzelino finally died at the age of 65, northern Italy let out a collective sigh of relief. Even Dante couldn't resist roasting him in the Divine Comedy, sticking him in hell's river of blood, which honestly feels like an understatement. Well, in this day and age, the death penalty is in effect in more than 50 countries, but their methods are less barbaric, regardless if it still kills the person. One of the most famous death penalties today is lethal injection, but you won't see any prominent figures being plastered like Dr. Jugular Vein, OD'd 500 criminals. They prefer to be less known now apparently. See y'all.